On a cold October morning in 2025, mist clings to the lawns of Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, Berkshire, softening the edges of a house that has stood here, in one form or another, since its rebuilding in 1840. Behind the pale stucco, in the great saloon that runs like a spine through the central block, high ceilings and intricate moldings float above tall arched windows that open onto the terrace, the kind of room a society column once called a domestic palace in miniature. This is the private face of monarchy. A Grade II listed retreat with some 30 rooms and 7 bedrooms, granted in 1931 to the Duke and Duchess of York as a country refuge from the formality of Windsor Castle. Now, hairline cracks track across the render, and scaffolding sketches an uneasy outline around the facade. The National Audit Office once quantified its worth in premiums, leases, and refurbishment costs. The latest photographs count the price in crumbling paint and blackening damp. In the saloon's tall windows, the morning light still falls as it did on George II, the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and later on Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. But the lease that secures these walls already bears a final date. The house was meant to be a refuge. It is becoming an argument with time. The story begins not with Prince Andrew, but with the landscape. By the early 18th century, on this same site in Windsor Great Park, a modest Queen Anne-style brick house known as the Lower Lodge or Dairy Lodge stood beside the Great Park's farm buildings, its red brickwork weathering quietly among the ancient oaks and carefully managed deer runs that had served English monarchs since medieval times. The house was small, practical, tied to the agricultural rhythms of the estate rather than to ceremony or state. Around 1750, military topographer and artist Thomas Sandby, deputy ranger of the Great Park, lived here, his surveys and drawings tying the house to a cartographic vision of the royal estate that would, over decades, transform wilderness into legible geometry. Sandby's presence marked an early pattern. Royal Lodge would always belong to servants of the crown before it belonged to the crown itself. His maps and watercolors, preserved now in the royal collection, show the house as a modest anchor in a landscape being reshaped by Enlightenment ideas of order, prospect, and controlled nature. The building was not yet architecture in the monumental sense, it was infrastructure, a place from which to observe and document the land. In 1812, the Prince Regent, later George IV, used the lodge as temporary accommodation while the architect John Nash drew up audacious plans for nearby Cumberland Lodge. Nash's vision transformed architecture into theater, picturesque cottages with thatched roofs, verandas draped in climbing roses, conservatories filled with exotic palms shipped from imperial holdings across the globe. The alterations began to reshape the Lower Lodge into a cottage ornée, a building type that pretended to be humble while concealing considerable expense beneath its artfully rustic surfaces. Thatch was laid by craftsmen. Every simple detail required calculation and cost. This was the Prince Regent's aesthetic, an architecture of deliberate fantasy where monarchy could play at being pastoral while remaining entirely removed from the labor that sustained such fantasies. The cottage ornée was a stage set, and the Prince Regent understood that even private royal life was, in some sense, a performance. The building's transformation announced a recurring truth. The crown landscapes its own retreats as a theater in which the monarchy can rehearse new images of itself, testing identities that might, one day, be required in public. The Royal Chapel of All Saints, designed by Geoffrey Wyatville and completed in 1825, rose a short walk from the lodge, its Gothic revival spire visible through the trees. The chapel added a devotional axis to this domestic enclave, binding worship to residents in a way that suggested the royal household's daily life was inseparable from divine sanction. Morning services, baptisms, private prayers. These rituals unfolded within architecture that insisted on continuity between earthly and eternal kingship. When William IV ascended the throne in 1830, he ordered most of the thatched cottage demolished, leaving only the conservatory and a few outbuildings. The gesture was abrupt, unsentimental. What had seemed permanent, Nash's carefully composed picturesque vision, disappeared within months, erased by a new sovereign's taste. The demolition underscored a core truth of royal architecture. What seems fixed is often only one reign solution, and the next reign may prefer to start again. By the time the dust settled, only a glass room survived, its iron-framed panes catching the morning light. The first version of Royal Lodge had vanished under a king's command. The house's later solidity would always rest on this memory of erasure, the knowledge that even buildings granted royal favor are subject to the whims of succession. By 1840, the site returned to life as a residence, rebuilt in a more conventional form. A stuccoed, symmetrical house rose where the cottage ornée had stood, reflecting the quieter Georgian and early Victorian taste that would come to define Royal Lodge's present silhouette. The new building was smaller in scale than palaces, yet dignified in its proportions. A 3-story central block flanked by 2-story wings, the whole composition painted in pale render that softened under the park's variable light. The architecture eschewed Gothic drama and picturesque theatricality in favor of restraint, an aesthetic that suggested propriety rather than spectacle. For decades, this rebuilt house served as accommodation for officers of the royal household, a working building in a working landscape. Estate records from the mid-19th century describe it as functional rather than ceremonial, its rooms occupied by deputy rangers, estate managers, and senior servants who oversaw the vast apparatus required to maintain royal parkland. The building's modest dignity reflected its role. Important enough to be well built, but not so grand as to suggest it housed royalty itself. The architectural plan consolidated the central block with 2-story wings that still frame the saloon's windows today. Later expansions would eventually bring the total to around 30 rooms, including 7 bedrooms, a double-height saloon measuring nearly 48 feet by 30 feet, a drawing room, a library, and a conservatory that retained a ghost of Nash's earlier vision. The floor plan followed a logic of modest hierarchy, principal rooms aligned along the garden front to capture light and prospect, servant spaces folded into the wings and outbuildings, invisible but essential. The saloon occupied the heart of the design, its tall arched windows reaching nearly to the ceiling, filling the space with southern light. The room's proportions, high, broad, with plasterwork moldings tracing the cornice and ceiling roses anchoring the visual geometry, created a sense of elevation without ostentation. It was a room designed to impress quietly, through spatial quality rather than gilded excess. The windows opened onto a terrace that descended via shallow stone steps to lawns that stretched toward the tree line. From inside, the view suggested continuity between interior and landscape, a seamless extension of domestic space into the ordered wilderness of the great park. The 19th century lodge reflected a changing royal culture. As the British Empire expanded and industrial fortunes swelled, the monarchy responded not only with grand palaces, but with domestic retreats, spaces designed to project simplicity, family life, and moral rectitude to a public increasingly attuned to questions of propriety and value. Royal Lodge, though rarely seen by the public, was part of this strategy. A house that looked like a large gentleman's residence rather than an inaccessible fortress, an architecture that suggested the crown could be at once elevated and, in some carefully curated sense, ordinary. Archival building descriptions from the later 19th century emphasize its informality and its integration into the park, more country estate than palace, more farm manager's residence than state room. This was an architectural assertion that monarchy, even when withdrawn from public view, remained rooted in landscapes that Britons recognized: parkland, gardens, modest stucco facades that might belong to any prosperous family of taste and standing. Yet beneath this surface, modesty lay the resources of the crown estate, the maintenance infrastructure of royal surveyors, gardeners, and craftsmen whose labor made simplicity possible. The house projected ease, but that ease was sustained by an entire economy of service, invisible to anyone who glimpsed the building from the park's public paths. In its second incarnation, Royal Lodge announced not grandeur, but moderation. A royal house pretending, in stone and stucco, to be almost ordinary. The pretense would prove durable. For more than a century, the building would serve as a stage for various performances of royal domesticity, each generation remaking the interior to suit new narratives about what monarchy should look like when it believed no one was watching. The house's modern identity crystallized in 1931 when King George V granted royal lodge to his son, Prince Albert, Duke of York, and his daughter-in-law, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, as a country retreat. The commission triggered a significant expansion and transformation. Architects added substantial wings on each side of the central block, nearly doubling the building's footprint and creating a more symmetrical, grander composition. The renovation preserved the saloon and principal Georgian rooms, but surrounded them with new spaces designed for 20th century comfort, updated bathrooms, modern kitchens, service corridors that allowed staff to move through the house without crossing the family's sightlines. Landscape designer Sir Eric Saville helped lay out a cohesive plan across roughly 98 acres, creating a designed landscape that balanced formality near the house with picturesque woodland further out. Lawns were leveled and seeded, formal plantings arranged in borders that framed the terraces, and winding drives laid out to connect the house to the two entrance lodges and flanking cottages that marked the estate's boundaries. The landscape design followed principles established by 18th century English garden theorists. The house should appear to rise naturally from its setting, surrounded by greenery that seemed artless, but was, in fact, carefully orchestrated. Inside, the suite of principal rooms was refined into a sequence culminating in the saloon, whose arched windows looked south over the newly designed terraces. Contemporary photographs show polished parquet floors catching the light, fireplaces framed in pale stone with carved mantels, and walls hung with royal portraits in gilded frames, a visual genealogy asserting that the Duke and Duchess, though presenting a modern domestic face of monarchy, remained rooted in dynasty and historical continuity. The furnishings mixed 18th century antiques with comfortable upholstered pieces, creating interiors that balanced formality with livability. The drawing room, adjacent to the saloon, featured tall sash windows that mirrored the saloon's arched openings, creating a rhythm of light and view along the garden facade. Here, the Duchess arranged seating groups around low tables, a layout that encouraged conversation and suggested informality even within rooms whose architectural scale proclaimed status. Photographs from the period show floral arrangements on side tables, books stacked on shelves, dogs sprawled on rugs, details that humanized the grandeur and made the house legible as a family home rather than a museum. In 1932, the people of Wales presented the young Princess Elizabeth with Booth and Bach, a miniature cottage built in the lodge's grounds as a 6th birthday gift. The tiny house, its name meaning the little cottage in Welsh, was fully fitted with scaled-down furniture, working plumbing, a kitchen with miniature pots and pans, and curtains that could be drawn across windows barely 3 feet high. The cottage mirrored the main residence in style and intent, a carefully crafted architectural lesson disguised as a gift, teaching the future queen that domestic order, cleanliness, and propriety were skills that transcended scale. Even play in this landscape became architectural rehearsal for a life lived under scrutiny. While the Duke and Duchess reshaped Royal Lodge, Britain navigated the turbulence of the interwar years. The Great Depression's shockwaves reached even comfortable households. Unemployment queues lengthened in industrial cities. Political extremism flared across Europe. Against this backdrop, country houses became both refuges and stages on which the monarchy tested a softer image. Royal Lodge, with its moderate scale and domestic emphasis, allowed the Duke and Duchess to project an identity distinct from the aloof grandeur of Buckingham Palace or the ancient weight of Windsor Castle. They were a family, at home, their children visible in photographs playing in the gardens, their routines presented in carefully managed press coverage as reassuringly ordinary. Architectural choices reinforced this narrative. The house was large but not palatial, elegant but not ostentatious. It suggested that the royal family lived well but not extravagantly, surrounded by beauty but not by gilded excess. This was monarchy adapting to a 20th century in which deference could no longer be assumed, in which the public expected accountability and, increasingly, access, if not to the building itself, than at least to the idea of the life lived within it. By the mid-1930s, the saloon's tall windows framed a family who believed they had found permanence in a house carefully remade around them. The Duke of York had not expected to be king. The role of Royal Lodge was to provide a refuge from duty, a place where the family could retreat from the relentless ceremonial demands of public life. History, already gathering force beyond the windows, was pressing at the glass. Within 5 years, everything would change. On 11 December 1936, after his abdication broadcast, Edward VIII, now the Duke of Windsor, took leave of his family at Royal Lodge before departing into exile. The event is sparsely recorded in photographs and diaries, but the house's architecture played a quiet role in this constitutional rupture. The informal drawing room and the saloon served as backdrops for private farewells that carried immense public consequence. In these rooms, a family confronted the collapse of the future they had imagined. The careful domesticity of the previous 5 years suddenly revealed as fragile. The abdication transformed the Duke of York into King George VI, thrusting him into a role he had neither sought nor, by his own admission, felt prepared to assume. Royal Lodge, intended as a retreat from responsibility, now became a place where the new king and queen could gather strength away from the unforgiving scrutiny of court and capital. The house's modest scale and relative informality made it a counterpoint to the overwhelming architecture of Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace, spaces whose grandeur seemed designed to crush rather than comfort. During the Second World War, George VI and Queen Elizabeth used the Royal Lodge as one of several refugees from the dangers of bombing in London. The ground's tree cover and the building's low, horizontally spread mass made it visually discreet from the air, a strategic advantage in a war that had turned architecture into target maps. While the royal family made a point of remaining in London during the Blitz, demonstrating solidarity with their subjects, Royal Lodge offered respite during quieter intervals, a place where the king could recover from the immense strain of wartime leadership. Archival records suggest the house functioned during the war years as both sanctuary and working retreat. The king brought dispatch boxes to the Royal Lodge, reading military reports and government papers in the library, while the queen corresponded with families who had lost sons and husbands. The saloon, with its tall windows overlooking lawns now given over to vegetable gardens as part of the Dig for Victory campaign, became a space where state business and domestic life intermingled, the architecture accommodating both. Informal photographs from the late 1940s and the later painting Conversation Piece at the Royal Lodge, Windsor by Herbert James Gunn capture the royal family taking tea in the drawing room in 1950, light glancing off polished furniture and painted portraits on the walls. In Gunn's composition, the family is arranged in careful choreography, the king seated, the queen pouring tea, the young princesses attentive and composed. The architecture frames them, the tall windows in the background opening onto gardens that suggest continuity and peace. The painting's mood is one of calm domesticity, a visual argument that the monarchy had weathered the crisis and emerged intact. The National Portrait Gallery's interpretation of the work emphasizes its domestic character and its role in shifting perceptions of monarchy after the war. The gallery's commentary notes that the scene shows the royal family taking tea in a way that would have been recognizable to all contemporary British people, an assertion that architecture, the room's scale, its furnishings, its light, could translate royal life into terms the public might recognize as familiar. The painting became, in this reading, an architectural document as much as a portrait, evidence of how space, light, and domestic ritual could be marshaled to construct an image of accessible, humane monarchy. In these images, the saloon's tall windows read as frames for domestic reassurance, the monarch as husband and father, the queen as wife and mother, framed by plasterwork that promises continuity. The architecture insists that despite war, abdication, and the enormous pressures of mid-century geopolitics, the royal family remains rooted in spaces that look, at least from certain angles, like home. Yet the painting also captures something more ambiguous. The room's scale, the formality of the furniture arrangement, the portraits on the walls. These elements remind the viewer that this is not an ordinary family, and this is not an ordinary house. The domesticity is real, but it unfolds within an architectural framework designed to signal status, lineage, and power. The tall windows that let in the light also look out onto an estate maintained by the crown, surrounded by security that, though invisible in the painting, is always present. Royal Lodge emerged from the war as a symbol of quiet endurance, a house that had absorbed abdication and conflict, and yet appeared unchanged, its saloon windows still filling with afternoon light, its gardens recovering their pre-war order. The building had become a repository of meanings: refuge, stage, symbol, home. For George VI, who died at Sandringham in 1952, Royal Lodge represented the life he might have lived had history not intervened, a country gentleman's existence centered on family and landscape, far from the ceremonial weight of the throne. The house, in surviving the war intact, became an argument for continuity. It suggested that some things, family, landscape, domestic ritual, could endure even when the world beyond the park gates was remaking itself in fire and upheaval. The architecture, still standing, still elegant, still filled with light, became a form of evidence. But evidence, like architecture, is always subject to reinterpretation. The meanings that seemed fixed in 1950 would not hold forever. After George II's death in 1952, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, retained Royal Lodge as a grace and favor residence, using it as one of her principal country retreats until her death 50 years later in 2002. The house shifted again in meaning, from the young family's refuge to the matriarch's court, its rooms now filled with her personal furniture, her collections of china and silver, her corgis, and the rhythms of a life lived increasingly in memory. Estate inventories and photographs from the second half of the 20th century indicate a layering of objects that reflected the Queen Mother's tastes and the accumulated history of her long life. Chintz-covered sofas in floral patterns softened the formal geometry of the rooms, their fabric choices, roses, peonies, pastoral scenes, creating an atmosphere of cultivated informality. Floral carpets covered the parquet floors, their patterns echoing the gardens visible through the windows. Family portraits mixed with earlier royal canvases, creating a genealogy in oil paint that stretched back centuries. The effect was one of comfortable grandeur, a house that acknowledged its own importance without insisting on it. The saloon retained its architectural scale, the tall arched windows, the high ceilings with their intricate plasterwork moldings, but the Queen Mother's routines domesticated the space. Afternoon tea unfolded here, in a ritual that mixed formality with warmth. Silver teapots, fine china, sandwiches, and cakes arranged on tiered stands, guests seated in groups around low tables. The Queen Mother presided over these gatherings with a skill developed over decades, her ability to put guests at ease legendary among courtiers and society figures who visited Royal Lodge throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Small house parties became a feature of the Queen Mother's tenure. Weekends at Royal Lodge followed a rhythm established in her youth and maintained with little alteration for half a century. Guests arrived late Friday afternoon, tea in the saloon, informal dinner, cards or conversation in the drawing room. Saturdays brought walks in the gardens, the Queen Mother pointing out plantings she had overseen, trees grown tall since the 1930s, the chapel visible through the trees. Sundays meant morning service at the Royal Chapel of All Saints, then lunch, then farewells. The architecture provided the frame. The Queen Mother's personality animated it. Newspaper features from the mid-20th century described Royal Lodge as a home rather than a palace, emphasizing its informality and the Queen Mother's preference for its lawns and intimate scale over Windsor Castle's ceremonial formality. These articles, carefully managed in their release of information, served a purpose. They allowed the public a carefully curated glimpse of royal private life while revealing almost nothing of substance. The architecture was always the focus, the beautiful rooms, the gardens, the sense of continuity with the past, rather than the complexities of personality, politics, or the emotional labor required to maintain such spaces. The building's Grade II listing in 1972 codified its architectural and historical significance within the National Heritage Framework. The listing described the house as a rare example of a royal country house whose interiors record the evolving self-presentation of the monarchy across the 20th century, noting the survival of key Georgian elements alongside 20th century additions. The saloon, drawing room, and conservatory were specifically mentioned, their architectural quality and historical associations deemed worthy of legal protection. The listing did not make Royal Lodge a public building. It remained private, accessed only by invitation, but it recognized the house as part of a shared national inheritance, a building whose significance exceeded the preferences of any single occupant. For the Queen Mother, Royal Lodge represented continuity in a life marked by enormous change. She had arrived as a young duchess in the 1930s, lived through abdication and war, watched her daughter become queen, and outlived her husband by 50 years. The house remained a constant, its rooms and gardens aging with her, their shared history inscribed in every corner. The terrace where she had played with her young daughters in the 1930s was still there, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The saloon where Gunn had painted the family in 1950 still filled with the same quality of light. The architecture, stubbornly unchanged, became a form of memory made physical. Yet the house also recorded the passage of time. Fabrics faded, carpets wore thin, paintwork yellowed. The Queen Mother's preference for continuity over renovation meant that by the 1990s, Royal Lodge had begun to show its age. The building remained elegant, but it was an elegance increasingly rooted in the past, a house that seemed preserved in amber, resisting the aesthetic changes of late 20th century taste. Visitors in the final years of the Queen Mother's life reported an atmosphere of gentle melancholy, a sense that the house and its occupant were both outliving their era. The saloon's tall windows still looked out over lawns maintained to perfection, but the world beyond the park gates had moved on. Britain was remaking itself again, the deference that had sustained the Queen Mother's vision of monarchy eroding in the face of new expectations, new critiques, new demands for accountability and transparency. In the Queen Mother's long tenure, the saloon's windows no longer framed crisis but continuity. The house became a memory palace for a generation who believed they had made it through the worst, who clung to rituals and routines as bulwarks against change. But time, which the architecture had been designed to defy, was already preparing its next transformation. The house that had seemed permanent for 50 years was about to become provisional again. For Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, Royal Lodge formed a key part of their childhood geography, a landscape that shaped their understanding of space, privilege, and the responsibilities encoded in architecture. The tiny Y. Booth Bach, still standing in the grounds, represented their first encounter with domestic labor and spatial management. Inside the miniature cottage, with its scaled-down furniture and working fixtures, Elizabeth practiced sweeping, tidying, arranging, rituals of domestic order that translated aristocratic play into training for a life in which every gesture would be watched, interpreted, and judged. Photographs from the 1930s show the young princesses outside Y. Booth Bach, Elizabeth bent over a toy broom, Margaret arranging miniature tea settings on a child-sized table. The cottage, though presented as a charming gift, functioned as an architectural lesson. Even play must be purposeful, structured, contained within walls that taught the proper ordering of objects and routines. The building, no more than 12 feet square, became a rehearsal space for the larger architecture of royal life, where every room had its protocol, every object its designated place. In the main house, daily life unfolded in a choreography of corridors and principal rooms. Mornings began with breakfast in the dining room, its windows overlooking the gardens, light filtered through lace curtains. The princesses had lessons in rooms designated for schoolwork, their education overseen by governesses who moved through the house with quiet authority. Afternoons brought walks in the gardens, supervised play on the lawns, tea in the saloon where the family gathered around low tables laden with cakes and sandwiches prepared by kitchen staff who remained, for the most part, invisible to the children. Later recollections and biographical studies note that the family valued the lodge for its relative seclusion within the great park, away from the eyes that followed them at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. Here, surrounded by acres of private parkland, the princesses could ride ponies, play with dogs, explore the woodlands under the supervision of protection officers who maintained a discreet distance. The architecture facilitated this illusion of freedom. The house's low profile and the landscape's tree cover created a sense of enclosure, a protected realm where royal children could be, briefly, something approximating ordinary. Yet the architecture never let them forget who they were. The saloon's generous proportions, the portraits on the walls, the formality of dinner settings even during private family meals, these elements asserted hierarchy in history. The house taught that domestic life, for royals, was never entirely private. Even in retreat, they inhabited spaces designed to remind them of lineage, duty, and the scrutiny that would define their adult lives. The National Portrait Gallery's interpretation of Herbert James Gunn's conversation piece at the Royal Lodge, Windsor, stresses the painting's domestic character and its role in reshaping perceptions of monarchy after the war. The gallery's commentary observes that the scene shows the royal family taking tea in a way that would have been recognizable to all contemporary British people, an assertion rooted in the painting's architectural setting. The room's scale, while grand, is not overwhelming. The furniture is comfortable rather than throne-like. The windows open onto gardens rather than forecourts. The architecture, carefully curated in the painting's composition, works to make kingship legible as fatherhood, monarchy as family life. Yet, the painting also reveals the limits of this domestication. The room's ceiling height, the quality of the furnishings, the portraits hanging on the walls. These elements insist on difference, even as the scene asserts familiarity. The architectural space is neither fully public nor fully private. It exists in a carefully managed middle ground, where the monarchy can be seen as human without ceasing to be royal. For the young Elizabeth, visible in the painting as a composed teenager, the saloon at Royal Lodge became a training ground in this double consciousness, the ability to inhabit domestic architecture while remaining aware that every gesture, every moment, might be translated into symbol. The spatial logic of Royal Lodge reinforced this training. Principal rooms flowed into one another along the garden facade, creating enfilades that allowed movement but also structured visibility. The family could retreat to private quarters, but staterooms remained always ready for visitors, always maintained to standards that assumed scrutiny. The house taught that privacy was conditional, that even in a country retreat, one lived in architecture designed to be seen, interpreted, and judged. For Elizabeth, who had become queen at 25, the lessons learned in Royal Lodge's rooms and corridors proved foundational. The ability to move between public and private roles, to inhabit formal architecture without seeming imprisoned by it, to use space to signal both accessibility and distance. These skills were rehearsed first at Royal Lodge, in a house that presented itself as home while functioning as a stage. The childhood landscape remained vivid in Elizabeth II's memory throughout her long reign. In later decades, she occasionally visited Royal Lodge during her mother's tenure, walking through rooms that had changed little since her youth, the same light falling through the saloon's tall windows, the same views opening onto gardens now matured into their full design. The architecture, stubbornly unchanged, became a form of continuity, a reminder that some things, buildings, landscapes, family rituals, could survive even as everything else transformed. For a future queen, the path to sovereignty ran not only through staterooms and ceremonial spaces, but through the quiet saloon at Royal Lodge, where ordinary rituals unfolded under extraordinary ceilings, where a child learned to be royal by playing at being domestic, where architecture itself became a form of education. The house, in teaching these lessons, prepared Elizabeth for a life lived always in the tension between private person and public symbol, a tension encoded in every room, every window, every carefully maintained facade. On 30 March 2002, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died at Royal Lodge, with Queen Elizabeth II and her cousin Margaret Rhodes at her side. The house, suddenly emptied of its longtime occupant, entered an unusual limbo. For the first time in more than 70 years, Royal Lodge had no resident, no daily routines to animate its rooms, no owner to oversee the gardens or approve the seasonal plantings. The building stood silent, its tall windows reflecting clouds and sky, its interiors shrouded in dust sheets while the Crown Estate contemplated its future. The question was practical, but carried constitutional weight. How should the Crown manage a property that was neither palace nor private home, that carried immense historical significance but served no current function, that was embedded in royal parkland but required maintenance costs that the public might reasonably question? The Crown Estate, a property portfolio held in trust by the monarch but managed independently and returning its profits to the Treasury, had to decide how to treat Royal Lodge within a framework increasingly attentive to public accountability and value for money. In August 2003, after more than a year of negotiations, the Crown Estate granted Prince Andrew, Duke of York, a 75-year lease on Royal Lodge and its associated cottages and land. The terms of the lease were unusual, reflecting both the property's unique status and the Crown Estate's desire to avoid open market complications. Andrew paid a premium of £1 million and committed to spend at least £5 million, later increased to an estimated £7.5 million, on refurbishment at his own expense. In exchange, he received a lease that, after the refurbishment costs were accounted for, effectively converted his obligations into a peppercorn rent, literally one peppercorn per year, with no further annual payments required for the lifetime of the lease. A National Audit Office report scrutinized the arrangement, its civil service pros unable to entirely conceal the unusual nature of the deal. The report noted that once Andrew committed to the higher refurbishment figure, he was treated as having effectively bought out a notional annual rent of £260,000, a calculation that transformed capital expenditure on repairs into rent prepayment for decades. The NAO justified the arrangement partly on security grounds. Royal Lodge's proximity to the Royal Chapel of All Saints and its location within Windsor Great Park made open market letting impractical. Separating the property from Crown control would have created security complications for the rest of the estate, requiring new access protocols and introducing unknowable tenants into a carefully controlled landscape. The report also acknowledged more prosaic concerns. Finding a private tenant willing to take on a grade-listed building requiring millions in deferred maintenance, located within a royal park with strict use restrictions, would have been challenging. The lease to Andrew solved multiple problems. It ensured the building would be maintained, kept it within royal control, and generated revenue for the Crown Estate without the complexities of public marketing. Yet the arrangement also froze the house in a new role. Royal Lodge was no longer a grace and favor residence granted by royal prerogative and revocable at will. It was now a leased property governed by contract law, its terms negotiable only within legal frameworks designed for property transactions rather than royal tradition. The house had been translated from the realm of royal custom into the language of real estate, its future determined by clauses specifying maintenance obligations, permitted uses, and termination conditions. Early 21st century Britain debated the costs of monarchy with increasing intensity. The civil list, Crown Estate revenues, and the distinction between public and private royal finances became subjects of parliamentary scrutiny and media investigation. Royal Lodge, with its unusual lease terms and multi-million-pound refurbishment costs, became a test case. Could a royal house be treated as an asset on a spreadsheet without altering its meaning? Could the architecture of monarchy be subjected to audit without stripping away the symbolic qualities that justified its existence? The answers were ambiguous. The NAO report assessed the lease as reasonable given the constraints, but its very existence, a government auditor reviewing a royal housing arrangement, signaled a shift in expectations. The public, or at least the portions of the public that paid attention to such matters, increasingly demanded transparency about royal finances. The mystique that had once surrounded buildings like Royal Lodge, the assumption that royal property existed in a realm beyond ordinary accounting, was eroding. For Andrew, signing the lease represented an opportunity to establish an independent household separate from the formal court structures centered on his mother and sister. At the time, he was still a working royal, undertaking hundreds of engagements annually as a trade envoy and representative of the Crown. Royal Lodge, with its 30 rooms and extensive grounds, offered the space and setting appropriate to a senior prince, a place where he could entertain visiting dignitaries, host official functions, and maintain the lifestyle expected of his position. The lease's 75-year term seemed to offer security and permanence. Andrew, then in his early 40s, could reasonably expect to live at Royal Lodge for the rest of his life, watching his daughters grow up in the same rooms and gardens where his grandmother had raised his mother. The architecture, once again inhabited by a family, would continue its role as setting for royal domestic life, its meanings accumulating another layer. The saloon's windows, empty for 18 months after the Queen Mother's death, filled again with light filtered through cleaned glass. The gardens, maintained by royal gardeners even during the vacancy, were prepared to be used rather than merely preserved. The house, which had stood silent through 2002 and 2003, began to hear voices again, footsteps in the corridors, doors opening and closing, the everyday sounds of habitation that give architecture its purpose. When Andrew signed the lease, the saloon's windows looked out on familiar lawns, the same prospect that had greeted George VI, the same trees now grown to full maturity, the same distant view of the chapel's spire through the greenery. But for the first time in Royal Lodge's long history, the house's future was written not primarily in tradition or royal prerogative, but in legal clauses and amortized refurbishments, in audit reports and property valuations. The architecture remained unchanged, but its meanings were shifting, moving from the realm of symbol into the realm of transaction. The lease was meant to secure permanence. It would prove to be the mechanism of dispossession. Between 2003 and 2005, Royal Lodge underwent extensive refurbishment funded by Andrew's private resources, work eventually estimated at around £7.5 million at 2002 prices, excluding VAT. The scope was comprehensive: roof repairs addressing decades of deferred maintenance, complete renovation of service infrastructure including electrical, plumbing, and heating systems, interior redecoration of principal rooms, restoration of historic plasterwork and decorative elements, and modernization of bathrooms and kitchens to contemporary standards. The project balanced conservation requirements imposed by the Grade 2 listing with the practical needs of 21st century life. Roof repairs proved particularly extensive. Surveys revealed that lead flashing had failed in multiple locations, allowing water penetration that had damaged timber rafters and ceiling joists. The work required scaffolding around the entire building, removal of slates and lead, replacement of compromised structural timber, installation of new roofing membranes, and careful reinstatement of the original roofline and detailing. Heritage consultants oversaw the work to ensure compliance with listing requirements, their approval necessary for any intervention that might affect the building's historic character. Inside, the principal rooms received careful attention. The saloon's tall arched windows were restored, their frames repaired and repainted, glazing bars reglazed where necessary. The room's plasterwork, dating from the 1930s expansion, was cleaned and repaired, missing sections recreated by specialist craftsmen using traditional materials and techniques. The parquet floor, worn after 70 years of use, was sanded and refinished, its geometric pattern of oak and darker woods emerging fresh and sharp. New lighting was installed, concealed within the ceiling roses and along the cornice, illuminating the room without compromising its architectural integrity. The drawing room underwent similar treatment. Walls were replastered where damp had penetrated, then prepared for paint and wallpaper. Fireplaces were restored, their stone surrounds cleaned, grates and firebacks replaced or repaired. The conservatory, the sole surviving element from Nash's original cottage ornée, received specialized attention. Its iron framework was stripped, rust-treated, and repainted. Glass panes were reglazed, and the structure's connection to the main house was waterproof to prevent the damp penetration that had plagued it for decades. Service areas received complete modernization. New kitchen equipment, designed to be concealed behind period-appropriate cabinetry, brought the house into line with contemporary expectations. Bathrooms were gutted and rebuilt with modern fixtures while maintaining proportions and finishes consistent with the building's character. The infrastructure, wiring, pipes, ventilation, was entirely replaced. a process requiring invasive work that opened walls and floors throughout the house but left the visible surfaces appearing unchanged. In 2004, Andrew and his daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, moved into Royal Lodge, relocating from Sunninghill Park, the house Andrew had shared with Sarah, Duchess of York, during their marriage. The move represented a new chapter. Andrew is a single father raising teenage daughters in a house scaled for grand entertaining, but now serving primarily as a family home. The girls' bedrooms were decorated in contemporary styles that contrasted with the formal reception rooms below. Their bathrooms featured modern fixtures and fittings that would have astonished George VI. In 2008, Sarah, Duchess of York, rejoined the household, creating an unconventional domestic arrangement inside a house long associated with more traditional family structures. The former spouses, divorced since 1996, maintained separate quarters within the 30-room house, their arrangement described variously as amicable co-parenting, friendship, or a unique solution to the complications of post-divorce royal life. The architecture accommodated this complexity, its multiple wings and extensive floor plan allowing for both shared spaces and private retreats. Media glimpses of the house during this period, typically brief and carefully managed, emphasized the estate's scale and amenities: 30 rooms, 7 bedrooms, tennis courts, gardens covering 40 hectares, even a private driving range. These details circulated in property features and society columns, casting Royal Lodge as a mini palace behind secure gates. The Guardian described it as elegant and spacious, while other outlets noted its antique furnishings and spectacular grounds, descriptions that conveyed privilege without delving into the complex financial and familial arrangements that sustained it. The architecture, once a symbol of modest domestic monarchy, was now increasingly read through the lens of inequality. By the late 2000s, property values across southern England had soared, making homeownership difficult for middle-class families and impossible for many working-class households. In this context, a 30-room royal residence maintained at a peppercorn rent became an easier target for criticism. Every pound spent on Royal Lodge's paint and plaster could be read two ways: as necessary conservation of listed heritage, or as the maintenance of a private playground in a public park. Andrew's tenure also introduced new layers of meaning. Where his grandmother had used Royal Lodge to project continuity and tradition, Andrew's occupancy became associated with a more ambiguous image: privilege without purpose, grandeur without corresponding responsibility. The house, which had served working monarchs and a beloved matriarch, now housed a prince whose public role, while active, lacked the historical weight of those who had preceded him. Sotheby's International Realty descriptions, though never formally listing Royal Lodge, referenced similar properties in the Windsor area, noting that houses of this scale, condition, and location commanded valuations in the tens of millions. The refurbishment costs alone, $7.5 million excluding VAT, exceeded the lifetime earnings of most British households. These figures circulated in media coverage, abstract numbers that nonetheless communicated the vast gap between royal living standards and those of the public who, through the Crown estate structure, ultimately underwrote the arrangement. The building itself remained beautiful. The saloon's proportions, the quality of light through its tall windows, the relationship between interior rooms and garden prospects, these architectural qualities persisted regardless of who inhabited them or how the arrangement was financed. The house had been designed to be elegant, and it succeeded in that ambition. But elegance, in an age increasingly attentive to questions of fairness and distribution, was no longer sufficient justification for what the building represented. By the late 2000s, Royal Lodge stood as a test of whether traditional royal privileges could survive in a democracy increasingly impatient with inherited advantage. The house, through no fault of its own architecture, had become a flashpoint. Its stucco facade, its manicured lawns, its protected location in a royal park, these attributes, once seen as preserving heritage, now appeared to some as evidence of a system requiring reform. The architecture continued to function as intended, providing shelter, organizing domestic life, projecting an image. But the meanings projected were changing, moving from continuity and tradition toward controversy and critique. The lease that had seemed to secure Andrew's tenure for 75 years was already, barely 5 years in, beginning to show cracks, not in the legal document itself, but in the public patience that ultimately determines what the public will accept from institutions claiming their deference. In November 2019, amid intensifying scrutiny of his association with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and allegations that would later result in a civil settlement, Andrew announced he would step back from public duties. The decision, framed as temporary but understood by observers as permanent, effectively ended his role as a working royal. Shortly afterwards, the personal royal standard that had once flown from Royal Lodge's flagpole was removed, a small but telling architectural detail that signaled the house no longer represented an active participant in the monarchy's public functions. The removal of the standard transformed Royal Lodge from a royal residence into something more ambiguous, a private home occupied by a member of the royal family who no longer performed royal duties, maintained in a royal park under terms negotiated when his status was entirely different. The building remained unchanged, the same walls, the same windows, the same rooms, but its public meaning shifted dramatically. Where it had once signified privilege justified by service, it now appeared to represent privilege without corresponding responsibility. Royal Lodge became the focal point of what journalists termed the Siege of Royal Lodge, a standoff between Andrew, determined to remain in the home secured by his 75-year lease, and King Charles III, newly ascended and keen to rationalize royal housing costs by relocating his brother to the smaller Frogmore cottage recently vacated by the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. The confrontation played out largely through press briefings and anonymous sources, a proxy battle conducted in newspaper columns rather than through direct negotiation. The lease's peppercorn rent became a focal point of public frustration. The arrangement, scrutinized and approved by the National Audit Office in the early 2000s when Andrew was a working royal, now appeared indefensible to many observers. How could a disgraced prince, stripped of public duties and military titles, continue to occupy a crown estate property for essentially no annual payment, while the country faced cost of living crises and ordinary citizens struggled with housing costs? Charles's position, conveyed through courtiers and palace sources, was practical and financial. Royal Lodge required substantial ongoing maintenance that Andrew, with his formal royal income terminated, might struggle to afford. The house was too large for one person, especially one no longer hosting official functions or requiring space for state business. Frogmore Cottage, recently refurbished at public expense for the Sussexes, stood empty and would serve Andrew's needs while significantly reducing accommodation costs. The logic was unassailable from an administrative perspective. Andrew's counterposition, equally clear if never formally articulated, was rooted in the lease itself. He had paid the premium, funded the refurbishments, and held a legally binding 75-year lease. The Crown Estate could not simply evict him without cause. The house was his home, the only permanent residence he had known for 2 decades, the place where he had raised his daughters. To leave would be to concede defeat, to accept a diminished status, to abandon the last vestige of the life he had built. Architecturally, the house became a metaphor for entrenchment. Newspapers published photographs showing the entrance gates, the high hedges, the security posts that had always been present, but now read as defensive fortifications. The building's 30 rooms, once presented as appropriate for a working prince, now seemed excessive for a private citizen. The elegant interiors and antique furnishings mentioned in earlier society features became symbols of disconnect, evidence of a lifestyle sustained by privilege rather than earned by contribution. The saloon's tall windows, once symbols of domestic openness and continuity, now read differently. They looked out onto lawns the public could not access, framed views of a landscape maintained by resources many taxpayers might question. The light still entered, filling the room with the same quality of illumination that had graced George VI's afternoon teas and the Queen Mother's house parties, but scarcely anything came out, No public role, no charitable work on the scale once undertaken, no justification beyond the bald fact of legal right. Security costs added another dimension to the controversy. Royal protection, funded by taxpayers through the Metropolitan Police, continued even after Andrew stepped back from duties. Parliamentary questions sought clarification on the annual cost of protecting Royal Lodge and its occupant, with estimates ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions of pounds. The Crown Estate's ownership and control of the surrounding parkland meant that securing Royal Lodge required coordination with Windsor Castle's protection infrastructure, a logistical complexity that multiplied costs. MPs from multiple parties raised questions about whether Andrew should retain publicly funded security given his private status. The responses, carefully worded to avoid revealing operational details, emphasized that threat assessments determine protection levels, not royal status or public opinion. But the underlying question remained: why should the public pay to protect a prince who no longer served the public, living in a house maintained at minimal cost to himself? The architectural symbolism deepened. Royal Lodge, designed over centuries to project royal permanence and domestic virtue, now embodied a different narrative. The persistence of privilege beyond its justification, the gap between legal right and moral legitimacy, the brittleness of arrangements that depend on public deference rather than public consent. The house, through no fault of its Georgian proportions or careful plasterwork, had become the physical manifestation of an argument about what the public owes royalty and what royalty owes the public. Comparisons circulated in media coverage: Royal Lodge's 30 rooms versus the average British home's 3 bedrooms, its 40 hectares versus the typical garden's few dozen square meters, its peppercorn rent versus the median monthly rent in Windsor, which exceeded what many families earned in a week. These comparisons were not architecturally sophisticated. They ignored the building's listing requirements, its heritage value, the complications of its location, but they were rhetorically effective, translating abstract privilege into concrete contrasts that resonated with public frustration. For Andrew, the house represented something beyond mere accommodation. It was continuity with his grandmother's memory, connection to his mother's childhood, the setting where his daughters had grown up, the last bastion of the life he had imagined for himself before everything collapsed. To defend his right to remain was to defend, however futilely, the idea that some things, home, family, heritage, might resist the forces demanding his complete erasure from public life. For the public, or at least the vocal portions of it, Royal Lodge represented the opposite: the stubborn persistence of arrangements that no longer made sense, the refusal of the privileged to accept consequences, the gap between what the public expected of royalty and what royalty now delivered. The building, stubbornly occupied, became a daily reminder of this disconnect. The saloon's tall windows, empty of purpose but still framing the same views, captured the house's transformation. The architecture that had once projected intimacy and continuity now projected isolation and refusal. The light still entered, but the meanings passing through the glass had inverted entirely. Royal Lodge, built and rebuilt to make the monarchy seem permanent and domesticated, had become instead a monument to impasse, a beautiful building trapped in an argument it could not resolve. By 2024 and 2025, photographs of Royal Lodge circulating in the press showed visible deterioration: cracks tracking across the stucco facade, crumbling paintwork exposing render beneath, and patches of black mold blooming across exterior walls near ground level. These images, captured by photographers using long lenses from public paths at the edge of the Great Park, documented what maintenance schedules and listing obligations had always predicted. Buildings require constant intervention, and when intervention ceases, decay accelerates. Reports suggested that bringing the building back into good repair could require around £2 million in additional work, on top of earlier roof repairs said to cost hundreds of thousands. The figures were estimates, leaked through sources familiar with Crown Estate assessments, but they carried weight because they were specific. $2 million was a number that could be comprehended, compared, judged. It was more than most people would earn in a lifetime. It was the cost of keeping one person in a house many considered too large for their needs. Under the terms of his lease, Andrew was responsible for keeping Royal Lodge in good and tenantable repair and condition, with specific requirements for interior redecoration every 7 years and exterior painting every 5 years. These obligations, standard in commercial and residential leases for historic buildings, transformed architecture into an ongoing financial test. The house demanded investment, not occasionally but constantly, its fabric requiring a level of maintenance that only substantial and reliable income could sustain. As Andrew's formal income diminished, his trade envoy role ended, his military positions relinquished, his patronage of charities ceased. Questions about how he could afford the necessary work intensified. Parliamentary committee hearings featured exchanges about royal finances, in which Royal Lodge appeared as Exhibit A, evidence of arrangements that made sense when negotiated but had become untenable when circumstances changed. The Crown Estate, questioned about whether it could compel repairs under the lease, confirmed that it could but acknowledged that enforcement might prove complicated given the tenant's identity and the property's location. The images of deterioration altered the building's public meaning again. Where photographs from the early 2000s had shown pristine stucco and manicured gardens, where the Queen Mother's era had been documented in pictures of flawless Georgian elegance, now the visual record showed cracks and stains. The house, once a symbol of permanence, revealed itself as subject to the same forces that afflict any building: water penetration, freeze-thaw cycles, biological growth, the relentless entropy that architecture is designed to resist but can only delay. The cracks were hairlines in some areas, wider in others, following the stress lines where different sections of the building met or where settlement had created differential movement. Structural engineers, commenting anonymously in press reports, suggested the damage might be largely cosmetic, render failure rather than structural compromise, but emphasized that left unaddressed, cosmetic problems become structural ones. Water enters through cracks, saturates walls, reaches timber, causes rot. What begins as aesthetics ends as engineering. The black mold, visible as dark staining near ground level, indicated persistent dampness and inadequate drainage. Heritage conservation specialists noted that listed buildings present particular challenges. Modern waterproofing techniques can trap moisture within historic masonry, creating conditions for decay. The solution, improved drainage, breathable lime renders, careful repointing, requires expertise and significant cost. Cheap repairs often worsen the problem. Proper repairs require the kind of investment Andrew's diminished circumstances made difficult. These technical details, disseminated through property news, coverage in heritage journals, gave the controversy an unexpected dimension. Royal Lodge was not merely a symbol of privilege, but an actual building with physical needs that transcended politics and public opinion. The architecture did not care about Andrew's status or the public's anger. It required maintenance according to its own material logic, and if that maintenance was not provided, it would decay according to the same logic that governs every built structure on Earth. For some observers, the visible deterioration prompted unexpected sympathy. The building, after all, was listed heritage, part of the National Architectural Record. Allowing it to decay through neglect, whatever the tenant's failings, seemed a collective failure rather than simply Andrew's problem. The architecture possessed value independent of its current occupant, and that value deserved protection even if protecting it meant, however indirectly, allowing Andrew to remain. For others, the crumbling facade reinforced the argument for his departure. If he could not maintain the house according to his lease obligations, he should leave so that someone with adequate resources, whether another royal, the Crown Estate itself, or a carefully selected private tenant, could prevent further deterioration. The building's decay became evidence not of architectural vulnerability, but of personal failure, Andrew's inability to sustain the lifestyle he insisted on maintaining. The saloon's interior, unseen in these external photographs, presumably remained elegant. The tall windows still framed the garden views, the plasterwork still traced its elaborate patterns across the ceiling. The parquet floors still bore the polish of careful maintenance. Inside, protected from weather and biological growth, the principal rooms likely showed little change from the 2000s refurbishment. but the facade's visible decay suggested that external appearances and internal realities might be diverging, the public face crumbling while the private life within continued largely unchanged. Heritage organizations, typically focused on preservation rather than politics, found themselves in an awkward position. Royal Lodge's listing meant its conservation was a legitimate public interest, but advocating for resources to maintain a disgraced prince's home proved politically impossible. Statements from English Heritage and similar bodies emphasized the building's significance while carefully avoiding any comment on its occupant or the controversy surrounding his tenure. The architecture was important. The human drama was someone else's concern. In the close-up shots of peeling paint and cracked render, the story revealed itself as surprisingly simple beneath the layers of constitutional complexity and financial arcana. Stone and plaster, subject to rain and temperature fluctuation and biological colonization, will always win their argument with paperwork. Leases do not keep water out. Legal rights do not prevent decay. The building's physical needs existed in a realm entirely separate from the human conflicts playing out in its name, and those needs would persist regardless of who ultimately prevailed in the struggle for possession. Royal Lodge, in showing its cracks, reminded observers of an uncomfortable truth. Architecture is always more fragile than it appears. The stucco facade, which had seemed permanent for nearly 2 centuries, was actually a thin skin requiring constant attention. The grandeur was real but provisional, sustained only through ongoing investment of resources and care. The house, like any house, was engaged in a continuous struggle against entropy, and in that struggle, it required allies with deep pockets and long-term commitment. Whether Andrew could be that ally had become the central question. The building itself, cracking and staining in the damp English climate, was beginning to suggest an answer. By the autumn of 2025, Royal Lodge had become a lightning rod for debates that extended far beyond one building or one occupant. News outlets from tabloids to broadsheets detailed how Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, having relinquished most formal titles after the settlement of civil litigation, was living at a Crown estate property for a peppercorn rent, while many citizens struggled with housing costs exacerbated by inflation and stagnant wages. The contrast became a ready-made metaphor for entrenched privilege, a single building crystallizing frustrations about inequality, accountability, and the costs of sustaining a monarchy in the 21st century. MPs from multiple parties raised questions during parliamentary sessions about Royal Lodge and the broader issue of royal property arrangements. Why should Crown estate properties be leased to members of the royal family on terms unavailable to ordinary citizens? How could the public justify funding security for a private residence occupied by someone no longer performing public duties? Should legislation compel greater transparency about royal finances, including property arrangements that, while technically not funded by taxpayers, depended on Crown assets that ultimately belonged to the nation? The Crown Estate and National Audit Office, responding to these inquiries, defended the original lease as appropriate in its early 2000s context. The property required a tenant willing to invest millions in immediate refurbishment, accept ongoing maintenance obligations, and tolerate use restrictions imposed by its listing and location. The security complications of open market letting were real, not invented to justify favorable treatment. Given these constraints, the lease to Andrew had represented a reasonable solution to a complex property management problem. But time had changed the variables that made the arrangement defensible. Andrew was no longer a working royal undertaking hundreds of engagements annually. His public reputation had collapsed. His income had diminished. The security rationale remained, but the reciprocal public service that had justified public protection no longer existed. The lease, negotiated when Andrew was one of the monarchy's most visible representatives, now secured his occupancy of a significant property despite his retreat from public life. Calls for legislative intervention escalated. Some MPs proposed an act of Parliament to compel the Crown estate to terminate the lease on public interest grounds, though legal experts questioned whether such legislation could survive challenges based on property rights and contract law. Others suggested tax changes that would make large properties less advantageous, though these proposals faced opposition from landowners and heritage organizations concerned about unintended consequences for historic estates. Commentators framed Royal Lodge as a case study in how royal property leases intersect with public funds and expectations of fairness. The building itself became almost incidental to arguments that ranged across constitutional theory, property law, tax policy, and the broader question of whether Britain should retain a monarchy at all. Royal Lodge, one house in a park, had somehow become a focal point for the most fundamental questions about privilege, inheritance, and democratic accountability. For the architecture, this was a strange inversion. The building had been designed, across its various incarnations, to withdraw monarchy from public scrutiny, to provide a refuge where royal inhabitants could retreat from the unrelenting demands of ceremony and visibility. Now, Royal Lodge was at the center of public attention, its every detail, room counts, maintenance costs, lease terms, subjected to analysis and critique. The house that was meant to be invisible had become hyper-visible, not through choice, but through the force of controversy that had attached itself to its occupant. The saloon's tall windows, still looking out over the same lawns, now served as imagined backdrops for headlines about entitlement, accountability, and the costs of conservation. Journalists and photographers, unable to access the property itself, relied on aerial photographs and long lens shots that turned the building into a distant, fortified presence. These images, circulated endlessly online and in print, transformed Royal Lodge into an abstraction, not a specific building with specific architectural qualities, but a symbol that could be loaded with whatever meanings the observer wished to project. Public opinion polls, when they addressed royal property issues, showed majorities favoring greater transparency and reduced costs. Royal Lodge featured prominently in questions about whether the monarchy represented good value for money, with respondents frequently citing the peppercorn rent and deteriorating facade as evidence of mismanagement and excess. The building, which had once projected the monarchy's ability to blend grandeur with domesticity, now projected its vulnerability to criticism and its dependence on public forbearance. Heritage advocates found themselves caught between competing obligations. The building's listing meant its preservation was a legitimate concern, but defending resources for its maintenance required arguing, however indirectly, that Andrew's continued occupancy served the national interest. Few were willing to make that argument explicitly. Instead, statements from conservation organizations emphasized Royal Lodge's architectural significance while carefully avoiding any comment on immediate controversies. The building was important. What happened to it in the near term was a political rather than architectural question. The controversy revealed tensions within the concept of heritage itself. Buildings become heritage through a combination of age, architectural quality, and historical association. Royal Lodge qualified on all counts. Nearly 2 centuries old in its present form, elegant in design and execution, associated with monarchs and moments of national significance. But heritage status creates obligations that someone must fulfill. If the current occupant cannot or will not, and if the Crown estate faces political pressure not to subsidize maintenance, and if the public resists any solution that appears to reward failure, then what happens to the building? The question had no easy answer. Forcing Andrew out required justifications the lease might not support. Allowing him to stay meant accepting ongoing deterioration or finding resources for repairs through channels that would invite their own criticisms. Converting the house to another use, a museum perhaps, or accommodations for visiting heads of state, required resolving the lease and finding budgets in an era of fiscal constraint. Every option generated objections. Royal Lodge, once almost invisible to the public outside occasional society column mentions, had become more scrutinized than many palaces. Its walls carried, quite literally, an argument about who owns history. The building was Crown property, held in trust for the nation, but managed by an entity independent of direct government control. Andrew's lease gave him possession but not ownership, rights but not absolute ones. The architecture itself belonged to the nation's heritage record, protected by listing but dependent on private maintenance. Ownership, possession, and obligation were distributed across multiple parties, each with some claim, but none with complete control. This diffusion of responsibility, which in quieter times might have seemed a sensible allocation of duties, now appeared as a design flaw that prevented decisive action. Royal Lodge existed in a peculiar limbo, private enough that the Crown estate could not simply seize it, public enough that taxpayers felt entitled to object to its costs, historic enough that negligence would constitute heritage loss, but current enough that its occupants' failings overshadowed any architectural argument for preservation. The house, built to be a refuge, had become instead a battleground where competing principles, property rights, heritage conservation, democratic accountability, fiscal prudence, royal tradition, collided without resolution. The architecture, beautiful and vulnerable, stood at the center of this collision, unable to defend itself except by continuing to exist, hoping that existence itself might prove a sufficient argument for preservation. On 30 October 2025, Buckingham Palace announced that Prince Andrew and his family would leave Royal Lodge and relocate to privately funded accommodation on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. The statement, brief and formal, tied the decision explicitly to his long-standing associations with Jeffrey Epstein and the broader desire to sever remaining official ties between Andrew and the working monarchy. The move, it was emphasized, would be funded privately, with no cost to the sovereign grant or taxpayers. The date of departure was not specified, but palace sources suggested the relocation would occur within months rather than years. The announcement drew a line under more than 2 decades, during which the house had functioned as Andrew's primary residence, and more than 70 years, during which Royal Lodge had served as a retreat for senior royals. The building would now enter another transition, its future undetermined, but its recent past concluded. The architecture, which had absorbed so many meanings across nearly 2 centuries, prepared to be emptied and redefined once more. Under the terms of the 75-year lease negotiated in 2003, early termination within the first 25 years triggered compensation provisions designed to protect the tenant's investment in the property. Reports suggested compensation of around £558,000 for lost residency years, a figure calculated based on the unexpired portion of the initial 25-year period during which termination costs applied. After that threshold, the compensation would taper, eventually reaching 0 for terminations occurring after the 25th year. Crown estate sources, speaking anonymously, indicated that the final compensation figure might be offset by the cost of repairs the Crown estate would otherwise have had to compel under Andrew's maintenance obligations. The deteriorating facade, the deferred exterior painting, the accumulated maintenance needs, these would require substantial investment regardless of who occupied the property next. If those costs exceeded the compensation due for early termination, Andrew might receive nothing. If they fell short, he would receive the difference. The calculation illustrated how architectural decay becomes a financial as well as physical negotiation, the building's material needs transformed into ledger entries that would determine the terms of departure. The announcement reframed Royal Lodge, once more, not as Andrew's embattled fortress, but as a property in transition, a building whose next chapter remained unwritten. Palace briefings emphasized that the decision was final and non-negotiable, though legal experts noted that lease termination would still require formal proceedings unless Andrew agreed to surrender the tenancy voluntarily. The distinction mattered. Forced eviction would require legal grounds and court processes. Negotiated departure could proceed more quietly, but required Andrew's cooperation. Future use of Royal Lodge remained officially unannounced, though speculation circulated immediately. Would another member of the royal family take it on? The Prince and Princess of Wales, with their young family, might eventually need more space than Adelaide Cottage provided, but Royal Lodge's 30 rooms seemed excessive for even their needs. Princess Anne or the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh were mentioned as possibilities, though both had settled homes elsewhere and might resist the disruption of relocation. Alternative scenarios included institutional uses, accommodations for visiting heads of state, housing for senior royal household staff, even conversion to a museum documenting the monarchy's 20th century domestic history. Each option faced obstacles, Guest accommodations would require substantial security infrastructure already provided elsewhere. Staff housing seemed an inefficient use of a listed building in prime parkland. Museum conversion would require access infrastructure incompatible with the property's location and could undermine arguments that Royal Lodge should remain a private residence. The most likely outcome, some observers suggested, was that Royal Lodge would stand vacant for a period while the Crown Estate assessed options and completed necessary repairs. The building had survived vacancies before, the 18 months after the Queen Mother's death, briefer intervals during earlier transitions. Empty houses deteriorate faster than occupied ones, but a short vacancy might allow comprehensive maintenance without disrupting residents. The architecture could be stabilized, systems updated, and any use restrictions clarified before a new occupant or purpose was determined. The Grade 2 listing ensured that key elements, the saloon with its tall arched windows, the drawing room, the conservatory, the overall Georgian massing and relationship to the landscape, would survive any internal rearrangements. Future occupants might repaint walls and replace furnishings, might modernize systems and reconfigure secondary spaces, but they could not alter the building's fundamental character without navigating complex heritage approval processes. The architecture would persist, protected by legal frameworks designed to preserve buildings deemed significant to national heritage. Y. Booth and Bach, the miniature cottage in the grounds, would presumably remain where it had stood since 1932, its tiny rooms, preserved as a curiosity documenting Princess Elizabeth's childhood. The little house, having survived the Queen Mother's death and Andrew's tenure, would likely outlast the current controversy, a diminutive but durable piece of architectural storytelling that required minimal maintenance and generated considerable public interest whenever opened for charitable viewing. When the removal vans finally rolled away down the tree-lined drive, past the entrance lodges that had marked the estate's boundaries for nearly a century, Royal Lodge would stand silent again. The saloon's windows would reflect empty rooms, dust settling on floors last walked days or weeks before. The gardens, maintained by Crown Estate staff even in vacancy, would continue their seasonal cycles: daffodils in spring, roses in summer, falling leaves in autumn, indifferent to the human dramas that had played out in their sightlines. The lease, that document negotiated in 2003 with such careful attention to security concerns and property management logic, would have done what architecture rarely does. It would have given the house an incontrovertible before and after. Before October 2025, Royal Lodge was Andrew's home, his refuge, his last bastion of the life he had built. After that date, it would be something else, undefined yet, but certainly different. The architecture would remain largely unchanged, but its meaning would be entirely transformed, the building's identity rewritten by the departure of its most controversial occupant. The announcement represented a victory for those who had argued that privilege without purpose should not be sustained, that royal property arrangements should reflect contemporary values of fairness and accountability. It represented perhaps a defeat for contract sanctity and property rights, though legal formalities might preserve the appearance that Andrew had chosen to leave rather than being forced out. It represented, certainly, the Crown's recognition that public patience had limits, that defending Andrew's right to remain in Royal Lodge had become a political liability outweighing any benefit. For the building itself, the transition meant survival. An occupied house receiving maintenance, whatever the occupant's reputation, was better than an abandoned building falling into decay. The announcement ensured that Royal Lodge would be preserved, that its historic fabric would be stabilized, and that its role as part of Britain's architectural heritage would continue. The house, having endured abdication and war, having outlasted the long reign of the Queen Mother and the shorter, troubled tenure of her grandson, would continue into an uncertain but at least secured future. The architecture, as always, would outlast the controversies it had witnessed, patient and persistent, waiting for the next chapter to begin. In the present moment, Royal Lodge stands at an inflection point between past and future, its immediate fate determined, but its longer trajectory still uncertain. The Historic England listing secures its status within the National Heritage Framework, ensuring that any future interventions must respect the building's architectural and historical significance. The saloon, drawing room, conservatory, and overall Georgian massing are specifically protected, their architectural character deemed worthy of preservation for generations yet unborn. The listing does not prevent change. Listed buildings can be adapted, restored, even substantially altered with appropriate permissions, but it ensures that change will be deliberate, documented, supervised by specialists who understand what makes the architecture historically significant. The miniature cottage Y. Buthenbach remains a carefully preserved curiosity in the grounds, its tiny windows echoing the larger saloon windows of the main house, a double register of royal childhood and national gifting that connects the building to moments of optimism and innocence increasingly distant in collective memory. The cottage, rarely opened but occasionally photographed, serves as a reminder that Royal Lodge's history includes joy and play as well as controversy and decline, that the estate witnessed childhood adventures before it became synonymous with conflict. The National Portrait Gallery's conversation piece at the Royal Lodge, Windsor, continues to hang in the collection, Herbert James Gunn's painting showing George VIII and his family taking tea in the drawing room in 1950. The gallery's interpretation emphasizes how the painting helped shift perceptions of monarchy toward domestic informality, presenting the royal family in a setting that would have been recognizable to all contemporary British people. The architecture in the painting, the room's proportions, the quality of light, the furniture arrangement, remains as important as the human figures, a visual argument that domestic space could bridge the gap between royalty and public. Archival photographs now chart the house's entire arc across nearly 2 centuries. Early images show the thatched cottage ornate of Nash's picturesque vision, theatrical and deliberately rustic. Later photographs document the rebuilt 1840 structure, dignified and restrained, its Georgian proportions establishing the template that subsequent expansions would follow. 1930s images capture the newly extended wings and Sir Eric Saville's landscape schemes. The building settled into its mature form. The Queen Mother's era is recorded in countless informal snapshots, garden parties, family gatherings, the small rituals of country house life. Andrew's tenure is documented in those more recent images, showing first pristine stucco from the 2000s refurbishment, then the telltale cracks and stains of deferred maintenance. Each photographic layer expresses a different answer to the same question: what should a royal house look like in its time? Future photographs will add new layers. Images of scaffolding and repair work, perhaps. New interiors reflecting different tastes. Or possibly, if institutional use replaces residential occupation, photographs of empty rooms arranged for viewing rather than living. The building transformed into its own museum. The archive continues to grow, each generation adding its visual record to the accumulated documentation of a building that has somehow mattered enough to be worth photographing across 2 centuries. Philosophically, Royal Lodge exposes the limits of using architecture to outlast mortality. The generations who have lived, ruled, played, and declined within its rooms are now represented by signatures on leases, portraits on gallery walls, and entries in estate records. George VI and Queen Elizabeth, who believed they were making a permanent home in the 1930s, are remembered now through Gunn's painting and a handful of archival photographs. The Queen Mother, who occupied the house for half a century, left behind her furnishings and gardens, but not her presence. Andrew's tenure will be remembered primarily through controversy and decline, the building's cracks and the lease negotiations overshadowing any private domestic happiness that may have unfolded within its walls. The building's desire, if one may speak of such a thing, to remain a stable frame for royal life has been undermined by the very forces that built it: political change, public opinion, economic constraint, the simple fact that humans are temporary and their arrangements more temporary still. Architecture can resist time longer than flesh, but it cannot resist the meanings that humans project onto it, meanings that shift with circumstances beyond any building's control. The saloon, at the center of this history, returns as a closing image. Its tall arched windows have looked out over the same lawns for more than 80 years, since the 1930s expansion gave them their current form. The glass has been replaced, the frames repaired, the room redecorated multiple times, but the essential architectural gesture remains. Large openings connecting interior space to landscape, an assertion that the building belongs to its setting, that inside and outside are continuous rather than separate. Once these windows framed a young Elizabeth at tea, learning the rituals of domestic order that would, in unexpected ways, prepare her for sovereignty. Later they framed the Queen Mother's afternoon gatherings, her long reign as family matriarch conducted in rooms that changed little across 5 decades. More recently they framed Andrew in retreat, the same light falling through the same glass onto a figure increasingly isolated and embattled, the architecture unchanged, but the meanings transformed by circumstances outside the building's walls. Soon these windows may frame someone else entirely, another royal perhaps, or rooms arranged for institutional purposes, or simply empty space awaiting determination of future use. Or the windows may remain closed, curtains drawn, the house silent during the months or years required to complete repairs and resolve questions about its next role. The glass has not changed across these transitions. The meanings passing through it have multiplied and shifted and sometimes inverted entirely, but the architecture persists, patient and mute. Royal Lodge was built and rebuilt across 2 centuries to make monarchy seem permanent, domesticated, and above the churn of ordinary life. Its history shows instead that even a house anchored in royal parkland, protected by listing, maintained by crown resources, is subject to the same truth as any human life. It endures not by defying time, but by becoming part of the record that time leaves behind. The building will outlast Andrew, will probably outlast Charles, may outlast the monarchy itself in its current form. But it will endure as architecture, not as symbol. Its meanings will be assigned and reassigned by future generations according to their concerns and values, the building itself unable to control how it is remembered or what it is asked to represent. In the end, this is the work of architecture, to provide a stage for human dramas it does not author, to frame lives it cannot prolong, to suggest permanence while remaining always vulnerable to the forces, political, economic, material, that determine which buildings survive and which do not. Royal Lodge has survived so far and likely will continue to survive, but survival is not the same as triumph. The house stands as it has stood, beautiful and patient, waiting to learn what meanings the future will project onto its carefully proportioned rooms and its tall windows that have witnessed so much yet revealed in their transparency, almost nothing of what unfolded behind them.